It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the Philips 276E8VJSB, as usual for a Philips monitor, not a model number that really rolls off the tongue. As usual for a video review, you have to remember that what you see depends on my camera, it depends on the processing done by my video software, by YouTube, and ultimately on your own monitor. So what you see certainly doesn't represent what you'll actually see on the monitor firsthand. As usual, this video review accompanies a longer and more detailed written review, and you can find a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. This monitor uses a 27-inch 4K UHD, that's 3840 by 2160 IPS type panel. This has a light matte screen surface, which preserves the clarity and vibrancy better than stronger matte screen surfaces, and doesn't have the same kind of effect on the image when observing lighter shades. So it doesn't have a kind of overly grainy look or anything like that. There's a little bit of light graininess, but nothing extreme. The resolution offers a really nice amount of desktop real estate. I use 125% scaling, and that's because without any scaling I feel that elements are just too small. I can use the monitor without any sort of scaling, so 100% scaling or any sort of application specific zoom, but I find that things just look unnaturally small and it just doesn't really sit well with me. Individual users will have their own preferences, but even if you are using a bit of scaling, so I'm using 125% here as I said, you do get a massive amount of desktop real estate at your disposal. So it's really good for multitasking, or if you're that way inclined, just focusing on one document and seeing loads of text on the page at the same time. And the text has excellent clarity due to the high pixel density. Same for images, suitably high resolution image content. Games in particular really look very nice indeed with this resolution. And that's explored a bit more in the written review, and there's also an article on our website all about the 4K UHD experience, focusing on models of this kind of size. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So it has a simple design, has a crescent-shaped stand, and that is a powder-coated metal, so it's pretty solid. It gives a decent base, even though it's a fairly slim design for the actual stand base. The bottom bezel is glossy black plastic, or as I like to call it, fingerprint and dust magnet black plastic. There's also a central Philips tag, a little transparent tag, and that has a joystick behind it, and that controls the UHD, the on-screen display menu system, which is explored in a separate video. There's also a power LED, and the monitor's unplugged now, so that's off at the moment, and that'll be a little white thing there you'll see when I'm actually using the monitor. It's fairly bright, and you can't actually disable it in the UHD, so that could annoy some users. I just suggest putting a little bit of black tape over it if it does annoy you, but I think most users will find it alright. At the top and sides, the monitor has a dual stage bezel design, or a three-sided borderless design, whatever you want to call it. So that means it has a thin hard plastic out component, as well as a panel border. The panel border blends in seamlessly when the monitor's switched off, but when the monitor's on you can see this more clearly. And even with both components, the bezels remain very slender. There are exact measurements given in the written review. The screen surface is light matte anti-glare, so it offers good glare handling, and it also maintains a good level of clarity and vibrancy with the image, and certainly maintains that better than some matte screen surfaces. And I explore that a bit more later on in the review, and I've also mentioned that a bit just before this section of the review as well. One thing to be aware of at the front, there are some little sort of notches, if you like, and they're very difficult to see in this lighting, and they're not really going to come out in the video, but basically it looks like the panel border is sort of worn away slightly there. It's just a tiny little dot, a couple of dots there, exactly the same in the other corner, and I think there's one sort of around here and one here. I can't even see them properly in this lighting, so they won't come out in the video, but basically these very faint marks, they're not damage. These are actually calibration marks used by the machine that puts the panel together. So it's completely normal and it's not damage at all. It has quite a slender side profile. The thinnest point in particular, it's quite thin. It does lump out a bit more centrally in where the stand attaches. It's also quite a shallow design, so it doesn't take up a lot of desk space. That'll come as welcome news to people who don't have a huge amount of desk space. So you can put the monitor quite close to the wall and the screen itself is actually not particularly far forwards relative to the front of the stand. So that's actually quite a good sort of compact design, and it allows you to have a bit of distance between yourself and the screen, even if you've got a fairly small desk. The stand itself offers tilt as the only ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt the monitor backwards slightly and forwards very slightly. It's difficult to do that with one hand, I'm afraid, but so that's it tilted backwards. It actually goes back quite far and just forwards a little bit. At the rear of the monitor, glossy black plastic dominates, so this fingerprint magnet, dust magnet stuff is used a lot at the rear. It was also used at the side and the bottom bezel. I don't much like this material, but to be honest, the rear of the monitor just faces the wall, so it doesn't really bother me too much. Other things to note: there's a Kensington lock slot towards the bottom right, and the ports in the central region above the stand attachment point. There are two HDMI 2 ports, there is DisplayPort 1.2, and there's a 3.5mm headphone jack. There's also a DC power input, which means that an external power brick is used by the monitor. You'll notice in the centre there are no VESA holes. Indeed, the monitor wouldn't be as thin as it did if there were VESA holes, so there is no alternative mounting provided for this monitor. There's just the included stand and the limited ergonomic flexibility that provides. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. It uses an IPS type panel. This has a specified static contrast ratio of 1000 to 1. According to my testing, I did get near this, a little bit below that, using my test settings, but nothing substantial. So really the static contrast is as much as I'd expect from this panel type. Being an IPS type panel, you do have IPS glow to contend with. This is something you can see in the video towards the corners there, but it's actually exaggerated a bit in the video, and the camera does exaggerate this a bit. But that's good because it helps me sort of highlight the effect. From a normal viewing position, and I've set up the camera roughly so it corresponds to the kind of normal ergonomically correct viewing position, you would see this most strongly towards the bottom corners of the screen. This certainly isn't a low glow panel or anything like that. It has a moderate amount of IPS glow, quite typical for the panel type and size really. A nice thing about the IPS type panel is that the gamma performance is very consistent at various points of the screen. So with TN panels, you would see much higher perceived gamma higher up and much lower perceived gamma lower down. So things look washed out and flooded lower down. I mean, that's slight exaggeration, but they certainly look lighter than they should lower down, and you get extra detail revealed, and that gives you banding and that kind of thing. Whereas higher up, you have things looking more masked than they should, and darker shades appearing darker than they should. On games like this, that masking of detail towards the top of the screen, that would hide porous rock textures, and that means you don't know if you can climb certain surfaces or not, particularly if you're sort of lying back a little bit or you're sort of slumped in your chair. This exaggerates that effect. But this doesn't have that. I'm talking about TN panels there that have this, so this model doesn't have that effect. It also doesn't have the sort of black crush you get from VA models, but it doesn't have this sort of depth and atmosphere that a model with much stronger contrast would have, and in particular VA models are good in that respect. So each panel type does have its distinct strengths and weaknesses, and this model performs quite adequately in terms of contrast. It's pretty typical for your IPS type panel. And games like this, they do have lots of dark areas, so it is nice to have a panel with really strong contrast, which isn't really what you get here. But as I've mentioned, the sort of playability isn't affected by any sort of dodgy gamma shifts, and the overall level of detail in dark areas is appropriate, except for in the regions affected by IPS glow, which does indeed decrease the detail levels. There is at least no sort of excessive detail, which can lead to banding and that kind of thing, and so there's none of that. Brighter shades, such as up there with the light streaming in and the flames there, they look fairly smooth. They have just a sort of mild misty graininess from the screen surface, if you like. There's no sort of heavy smeary graininess, and actually this screen surface is one of the lighter ones you'll come across from a panel of this size and resolution. Quite a few 27-inch IPS type panels I've used that are sort of 4K UHD, they tend to have quite obvious graininess, even if they have a light or very light matte screen surface. So this monitor is better than many in that respect. And also the 28-inch TN alternatives, they're not quite as smooth as this, so the screen surface is fairly agreeable overall. I think most users will find this just fine. I'm now going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor, and as usual I like to talk a little bit about viewing angles and colour consistency using the Lagom tests for viewing angles. That's the website lagom.nl. The Lagom text test, this is quite a nice way of very easily seeing if the monitor has obvious weaknesses in the gamma curve related to viewing angle from a normal viewing position, or from a range of viewing angles if you're sort of moving your head around or the camera around. The results here are very good. It looks very blended. There's sort of a blended grey throughout. There's a slight sort of green tint to the striping of the text, but that's fairly consistent. There's no obvious saturated flashes of green or red, or flashes between green and red and orange, even if you move your head a bit, or I move the camera a bit. So this is very much better than what you'd see on a VA or TN model, and it identifies this very much as an IPS type panel. Just be aware that if you're using scaling and you're viewing this text, it'll look highly saturated and wrong, and it won't work properly as a viewing angle test. So certainly be aware that you have to be using zero scaling when viewing this particular test. The purple block appears a bluish purple throughout. There isn't any sort of strong pink hue which shifts around according to a little bit of head or camera movement. I mean, there is a little bit of movement as you move to more extreme positions, but overall from a normal viewing position you don't see that kind of thing. The red block looks pretty consistent, fairly rich red throughout. It doesn't have any kind of obvious pink hue either. With models with weaker viewing angle performance, you'll notice a pink hue which sort of shifts around very readily as you move your head or the camera just slightly. The green block is a good solid green. It has a slightly yellowish quality to it, but that's because the colour gamut is not massively wide, and that's completely typical for that. It is what I describe as a saturated green chartreuse colour, to be precise, and that is displayed on this monitor much as it should be and consistently throughout the screen. It doesn't have any sections which are more obvious in the yellowing. Again, weaker viewing angles can be revealed in that sense because there can be some sections which look more saturated green. TN models will have that further up typically. Lower down it'll appear sort of more yellow and more faded, so it doesn't have that kind of inconsistency on this panel. The blue looks a fairly solid blue throughout. There can be variation in this due to the uniformity, but even models with weak viewing angle performance such as TN models tend to be quite consistent with this particular shade. Now on Battlefield 5, I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some nice in-game examples, which is of course far more interesting than staring at Lagom. The scene I'm looking at here has a lot of nice autumnal reds and browns and some fairly rich green shades in places, and it's a scene which can sort of really look very nice on a monitor which has vibrant colour output, and it can certainly look rather lacklustre on monitors which don't have that. This monitor has a colour gamut which extends a reasonable amount beyond sRGB, although not massively so. What this means is it invites a little bit of extra vibrancy, a little bit of extra saturation, but nothing extreme. The colour gamut doesn't extend anywhere near as far as, for example, DCI P3 or Adobe RGB or anything like that. So if you're looking at reference colour spaces, sRGB is the closest reference, but it does extend a bit beyond that. It does have an sRGB emulation mode, so overall the colour reproduction is fairly faithful to the original content, which is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. There's just a bit of extra saturation and nothing extreme, nothing sort of cartoonish looking or anything like that. No sort of deep extra saturation. Things do look natural overall, but they do have a little bit of an edge in vibrancy. I think many users would like this kind of look. And because of the IPS type panel, there's excellent consistency, and you see a really nice variety of subtly different shades. As I mentioned, lots of autumnal reds and browns, but there's just slight variations of those shades, and they're displayed very consistently. So taking this red here, for example, this reddish brown, it looks very much the same regardless of which part of the screen you're observing that particular shade at. On TN models, for example, you would see the shade appearing sort of washed out towards the bottom, certainly less saturated, but much deeper than it should be towards the top because of the perceived gamma shifts. You don't have that kind of issue on this monitor, which is certainly very nice for gaming and just sort of general observations, and it's very important if you're doing colour critical work because of course you want accurate colour output. You can calibrate the centre of the monitor with any panel type and get colours looking right there, but if it's changing at different points of the screen, that's not helpful at all in terms of accuracy. I'm on Battlefield 5 again, and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. There's a very important concept to understand when it comes to monitor responsiveness, and that is the concept of perceived blur. There's an article all about responsiveness on the website which explores this concept and various other aspects of monitor responsiveness, and it's well worth a read if you're not familiar with this concept. There's also a little bit of a summary in the written review in the responsiveness section, all about perceived blur and what that means and the implications. But basically there are two main aspects of perceived blur on a monitor. One of them is the perceived blur due to eye movement, and this means that as you track motion on the screen, there's a certain sort of mask of perceived blur which occurs due to the movement of your own eyes, and this is closely linked to the refresh rate of the display and the frame rate of the content. So with this one you get a maximum 60 frames a second being optimal. It's a 60 Hz monitor, and you can see the frame rate in the top right. I'm not sure if that'll be clear on the video because it's a very small little frame rate display there, but I'm running this game so it's 60 frames a second as much as possible, and that means I'm getting the most out of the monitor. So there is a moderate amount of perceived blur just due to the refresh rate, and what this means is even if the monitor had a theoretical 0.01 millisecond response time, you'd still get this all the same. So this isn't anything to do with response time. The pixel responsiveness is also a factor which affects perceived blur, and in particular strong weaknesses here can really stand out and add to perceived blur. The good news is that this model doesn't have any strong weaknesses. It does have some imperfections, and I'm going to go through some of them here, but there's nothing that really stands out in an obvious way. So for the most part it's very much like using a much faster 60 Hz monitor, or one I should say that's faster on paper in terms of its pixel responsiveness. So there's a little bit of sort of what I'd call powdery trailing in places. I think there's a better example of that in here. So where there's particularly light shades moving against a darker background, so you can see that with this little sort of white blob here, it kind of just extends out a bit more than it should and has a little what I call sort of a powdery trail behind it. That's because the pixel responses for these particular transitions are a bit slower than optimal. There's also a little bit of overshoot in places, inverse ghosting. And what that means is you'll get trailing which is either lighter or darker than the background and the object colour, and certainly compared to the background, so it sort of stands out a little bit. It's not strong overshoot on this model though, so it doesn't really catch the eye. I don't find it eye-catching. Sensitivity to overshoot does vary though, but really I'd think that most users would find this just fine. There's a little bit of sort of what I call snail slime trailing behind the tree there, and that's kind of a partially transparent trail which looks like snail slime, that's why I call it that. And it stands out in the sense that it's sort of brighter than the background colour and certainly brighter than the object colour. There's also a slight sort of slightly colourful fringe, a very sort of slight amount of sort of purple trailing there, but it's really very slight and doesn't catch the eye at all. And you can see that on the flag as well, but that's more not so much the overshoot, that's more to do with some slightly slower than optimal pixel responses there. But there is some overshoot mixed in there. So, you know, I'm just pointing out these imperfections, not because I think people are going to really find them bothersome, just because they are there. There's also a little bit of what I call shadowy trailing. This is again overshoot, so you can see, or at least I can see when I'm observing this firsthand, there's a little bit of a shadowy dark trail behind the lamp there. That's a little bit of overshoot, and again it's not strong. It's not something that most users are going to find distracting or annoying. The monitor does have various different smart response settings, as they're called, so different response time settings. You find them in the picture part of the OSD. So smart response, I set it to faster. As I explore in the written review, I find that optimal. If you set it to fastest, you then get really obvious overshoot, so you should be able to see this on the video quite clearly. Rather than just there being a little bit of overshoot behind the tree and the flag post there, there's now strong overshoot, a very obvious bright trail which really is eye-catching. And there's the same thing up there as well. And around here, that sort of dirty trailing as I called it, it really it stands out in a very obvious way. If instead you reduce the smart response setting, so perhaps you want to use the fast setting rather than faster as I was using before, I think this is fairly well balanced as well. It's not going to be clear in the video because the differences aren't profound that it makes. It's explored a bit more in the written review, but I can see that the sort of powdery trailing which I was referring to before, there's now quite a bit of that here, and actually has a slightly sort of smeary quality to it. Not smeary in the sense that you'd get on a VA model typically. It's not really as obvious as that, and the pixel responses aren't as slow as that, but it does stand out a bit more and increase perceived blur a bit more because the pixel responses there have been slowed down. And here there's again a bit more powdery trailing, it sort of extends a bit more, and again has a little bit of a smeary quality to it. The overshoot is slightly reduced. In this particular example, it's still there, but it's slightly reduced, although I'd say it's reduced from sort of an already fairly low level anyway. And the sort of dirty trailing I was observing before behind the light, that's actually gone. But there's actually a little bit of powdery trailing, or at least weaknesses with pixel responsiveness, so you can see a kind of slightly orange fringe around the light where I can. And actually there is a little bit of the dirty trailing and the overshoot, but it's reduced, but again it's reduced from an already low level. So I think most users would actually find the faster setting optimal, but the fast setting is alright. If you set things to off, then the powdery trailing just becomes sort of very widespread and very obvious, but you don't really get any overshoot to speak of. But definitely the overall perceived blur is increased, and as a user who's sensitive to that, I don't like using this setting at all. So I think the faster setting is a good one for most people, but the fast setting is a decent fallback if you like a little bit less overshoot and don't mind a bit more conventional trailing. The other aspect of the monitor in terms of responsiveness is input lag, and that is nice and low on this model. I actually measured under 3 milliseconds of input lag, so it's not going to be a problem even for sensitive users. But do be aware, the 60 Hz refresh rate doesn't give you the kind of connected feel you get at much higher refresh rates and frame rates. To wrap up then, the overall design of the monitor, it's pretty simple, but I find it quite nice to look at. I like the crescent-shaped stand. I like the way it's sort of made of powder-coated metal as well. It's nice and solid, gives a sort of firm footing to the design and a nice premium feel. The bottom bezel, glossy black plastic. I'm not a big fan of glossy plastics, and there's plenty of that at the rear of the monitor as well. But it's all right. It doesn't really bother me too much. It's just personal preference. I would have preferred matte there. And they've got the slender bezel design, the dual stage design at the top and sides, and that's quite nice. The rear, there isn't any VESA holes or anything like that, and the included stand only offers tilt. So that's sort of the main area you compromise on this model, really. It's the flexibility and the lack of any sort of provision for VESA mounting. In terms of the contrast performance, as much as I'd expect from the panel type, it is around 1000:1 static contrast. There's some IPS glow, which affects detail peripherally. Nothing extreme, it's certainly not a low glow panel though. It has good tracking of the 2.2 gamma curve and also very consistent gamma tracking up and down the screen and at various different points of the screen. So unlike some other panel types, particularly TN, you don't get these kind of differences in dark shades depending on where on the screen they're displayed, which would affect the detail levels. You do, as I've mentioned, get IPS glow, however. The colour performance, the colour gamut extends a fair bit beyond sRGB, but not to an extreme level, especially compared to HDR-capable monitors with sort of a DCI-P3 colour gamut. So there's nothing like that, and it's not any traditional wide gamut that this monitor supports, but it just gives a little bit of extra richness and saturation to the image, but nothing extreme. So the overall shade reproduction is actually rather faithful to the original content, just a little bit of a more vibrant version of that. There's also an effective sRGB emulation mode if you want to cut down the colour gamut, and that worked nicely on this model without affecting contrast or anything like that. Colour consistency as well, as I mentioned, the gamma is very consistent, and that keeps colours in check in terms of the saturation levels at different points of the screen, very even, so it has a fairly vivid look throughout the screen, and it doesn't sort of have obvious shifts in saturation at different points as other panel types might show. The specific panel used in this is not an LG IPS panel, it's actually made by a Chinese company called Panda, and it's the first time I've used a Panda panel on a monitor before, so I wasn't really quite sure what to expect. But I'm actually really quite impressed with the overall quality of the colours on this monitor and just sort of the general image characteristics. I was also quite impressed with the screen surface. It was light matte anti-glare, but it also had quite a smooth finish. Sometimes on 4K models in particular, and especially the 27-inch models, they tend to have quite a grainy screen surface, even if they have a low haze value, so that's to say they're sort of light or even very light matte anti-glare. They sometimes still have a graininess when you're observing lighter shades. This has just a little bit of graininess, but it's really a reasonably smooth look to the image when you're observing lighter shades overall, so that was certainly a nice thing to see. In terms of responsiveness, there was not really a lot to complain about, other than the refresh rate, but that's obviously expected. It is a 60Hz monitor, like most 4K IPS models, and any of this sort of price, definitely. So that was sort of really the main barrier to responsiveness. There weren't any huge issues with pixel responsiveness. There's a little bit of powdery trailing in places from slightly slower than optimal pixel transitions, and there was a little bit of overshoot in places, but nothing eye-catching when you were using the optimal smart response setting on the monitor. The input lag was also nice and low, so that wasn't an issue. So overall, I feel that this monitor puts in a nice performance, a nice all-round performance. It doesn't have any real standout weaknesses or things that bother me. Certainly if you're looking for ergonomic flexibility, then that would really be the main sort of bone of contention. But in terms of the colour quality, it vastly outperforms your 28-inch TN alternatives, and that's really what you'll be looking at this kind of price. If you want features like FreeSync as well, or even basic HDR capability, then again you'd have to pay a bit more and consider one of the LG IPS models perhaps, because they're good as well, and the overall performance is pretty similar to this. Except one thing I would say is the LG models have a slightly grainier screen surface if you're fussy about that kind of thing. So if you don't really care about FreeSync or HDR capabilities or VESA mounting, anything like that, I really do think this is an excellent choice for a 27-inch 4K UHD monitor. So that's really all there is to the Philips 276E8VJSB. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.